founded CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, the largest CEO-driven business commitment to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace with 2,400 signatory organizations, as well as the CEO for Action for Racial Equity. He's a thought leader, a mentor to fellow CEOs, sharing frequent insights in the New York Times, Washington Post, Fortune, Harvard Business Review, and his LinkedIn newsletter, Talking Trust. Tim will be in a conversation with Dr. Rohini Anand, who I am so excited about because we have been friends for a really long time, so it's so great to introduce you as well. Dr. Anand is a founder and a CEO of Rohini Anand LLC, providing DEI advisory services to the public and private sectors. She's a strategic business leader. Most recently, she was the SVP for Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo, a trusted board member and published author. Her best-selling book is called Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide to a systematic change in multinational organization. On top of all of this, she's an amazing mentor who helps so many Asian women that I have been very fortunate to be able to get. So with that, if you don't mind, Tim, if you can come up to the stage, and Rohini as well.
Thank you, Anka. It's wonderful to see you again, and you have to come down to DC next time.
Yes, definitely.
But it's terrific to be in conversation with you, Tim. I don't think you need any introduction. Everyone here knows you, appreciates what you've done. And we had this session earlier, and this was a panel, and they talked about what they're looking for from corporate America. And one of the questions that I asked the panel was, what do you want what's your message to CEOs? What do you want them to do as it pertains to the external ecosystem? And you have made your commitment there with the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. It's just impressive, the number of signatories that you have. But more than that, I think what's really terrific is Tim's personal commitment. So I often say that change happens at the intersection of people and processes. You put in place systems and processes, but the personal piece is what's so critical. The curiosity, the courage, and the commitment to bring about change. And I was excited because I recall the interview that you had where you talked about, I think it was a manager who, you shared that story, about the manager who asked you, what are you going to do, right, on the heels of the Dallas shooting. And the learnings that you had from the racial dialogues that you sort of facilitated. So we'll get to that. But I'm going to get right into the questions, but I want to make sure that you folks have your questions ready because there is going to be time for Q&A. Just a couple more points in terms of context setting. One of the other things I really appreciate is the fact that you've spoken up and you think it's important for CEOs to speak up on social and political issues. And Tim, you talked very loudly about your opposition to voting restrictions because you thought it was important and it aligned with your values. So this is a time when we really need CEOs to speak up and to speak out. We're in some very volatile times. We had Randall Pickett who set some of the context of what's going on today. But we all know that after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, there was a 55% increase in corporate DEI roles, and companies made pledges amounting to over $12 billion to address racial inequities. But in 23, with the SCOTUS ruling and the trickle effect of that in corporate America, we have companies being skittish about their commitment to DEI. We also have the economic uncertainty, social unrest, and companies are quietly dropping their commitment to DEI. There was a recent Post article, I don't know if you saw that, but it said that in 2023, between 21 and 23, there was an 18% decline in CEO support for C-suite support for DEI. And the CDO role was the only C-suite role to be eliminated in many organizations. And in 24, DEI roles have already shrunk by 18%. and DEI on corporate earnings calls have also gone down. So these items, these news items are clearly of concern during these times when we really need to ramp up our efforts, but there are enough companies that are also continuing their commitment. So with that background, and to unpack all that for us, what I'd like to ask you is, your inclusion report talks about the SCOTUS ruling and the economic volatility and the social unrest. So can you provide some perspective for us on how these and other external trends are impacting what you're seeing, what you're observing as the commitment to DEI in corporations?
So Rohini, first of all, you hear me all right? Thank you for being here today, and John, thank you for inviting me here. And
yes, John.
Thank you for investing the time to have this conversation. The reality is that people are always going to be important. We had the Supreme Court ruling, and I have this privilege of meeting with 300 to 400 CEOs a year. It's part of the job, and it's really rewarding just to get here and talk to so many people. What's amazing is how many times this comes up. And usually it's from a position of care. I, the CEO, when I'm talking to CEOs, I care about this is important, but I also want to make sure that I don't harm my company and my people by saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And the reality is that's the reality many CEOs are trying to deal with, because if they take that harm, then they jeopardize jobs and demand and sales, and they're trying to figure out how to balance. The dialogue we're having with so many is, what are the best practices? How do you navigate a world that has become so polarizing? That's what's very much on people's minds. What I'm not hearing is, this is now unimportant. I'm not hearing that. What I'm not hearing is, I don't care as a leader. I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing, I'm trying to navigate this to do the right thing without jeopardizing the number of stakeholders that I have to look after, whether it be investors, customers, and ultimately they allow for jobs to happen. I was caught the last 15, 20 minutes of that panel on what's the dialogue or the recommendation for the CEO outside. To me, this is a time for bridge builders. It is incredibly difficult these days. The world is so polarizing. What we need is CEOs who will only be bridge builders. It's not about right or wrong, my way or your way. It's about understanding a common ground to build bridges to get to a better future that I think we all believe is out there. There's a better economic future, but there's also a better future. But that future has to be income from bridge builders. I think that's one of the skills, which means you got to be willing to be out there.
Yeah, that's great. So, I think that clearly there are organizations that are sort of rolling back their commitment, and those were performative to start with, right? And just basically based on headline news is what they did, was check the box. There are organizations that are maybe waiting and watching to see what's going to happen, and then there are others like Accenture, like PwC and others who are continuing their commitment. What are you seeing as sort of some of the good practices or best practices that are sort of enabling them to continue what they're doing? And then we can pick up on that second point you made about speaking up and speaking out.
Yeah, thank you. And I love how you categorize it in, halfway in, or all the way in the middle bucket. Like halfway in is the watching, then see. The leading companies, these are multiple years to change an organization's culture, and to your point in the intros, process. The best organizations are continuing, so it's not a fad, on or off, in vogue or out of vogue. So when I look at leading companies like Accenture, PwC, and many others, what we see people focus on is consistency, right? Like out of sight, out of mind, or insight on top of mind. So it's got to always be part of the agenda, first of all, from a practice perspective. That's tone at the top, and that's down to the middle. I heard the comment earlier about the middle, and I agree with that. I also am very cautious on any aspect of blaming the middle. It's senior leadership's job to spend time with the middle, to set a culture and set a tone that you're looking for. So my first best practice is consistency and persistency. The second one is talking about it and setting up and building a culture where you can talk about these issues, regardless of what underrepresented group someone is made up of, is having the conversations. It is amazing how many people in the white majority want to do the right thing, but don't know what to do, don't know what to say. And that one of the best practices is building that culture where it's okay to talk about it. This is how you know if you're mature as an organization. if it's from the top and we're gonna have a day to talk about it, that's good. But it's a lot better when it's happening naturally and you don't need a day to do it. It happens as part of the dialogue. Those are some of the best practices that I'm seeing, along with transparency. Maybe just one other one, is data. Like, one of the things that we've done at PwC is our leaders now have dashboards. Like, they have data. Like, in other words, I wake up, I believe most people wake up in the morning trying to do the right thing, and they need to have a tone and a culture to drive that. But having data at your fingertips to know, am I being fair? Do I look at the different metrics that run the business? Am I treating all my people fairly? Are they all taking their vacation? Are they getting a fair amount of shots? Are they getting the same shot of like the right amount of overtime? And that data then allows managers on the ground to make adjustments. Like, those are some of the best practices. Many of those leading companies have moved from what I'll say a great speech to your point about process. And that's what makes someone really great, I think.
So I think, even in the previous panel, they talked about intentionality. The consistency, I think, is absolutely critical. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of the dialogue piece? I think you did a fantastic job at PwC with that. And what was really impressive was not just that there was dialogue and engagement with your employees, but I think it was supremely disruptive, right? I mean, share the story about what you heard and how it shook your worldview about carrying the ID card. I mean, I know it's...
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go back to 2016, and I was elected by my fellow partners at the time, just under 3,000 partners, and I'll tell people at PwC we're a democracy, just like the United States, 2 4-year terms. Every party gets a vote. We're just a little more civil in terms of how we do it. But I had the privilege of being elected in 2016, and the first week was when there was violence in Dallas on the heels of Minneapolis and Louisiana, and again, it's 2016. It might sound like 2020 or other periods, but it was 2016. And what I realized at that point is, even though we were in our 4th decade of having a chief diversity officer, we hadn't gotten to that cultural point where we could talk about it. And one person suggested to me, as good as we are, the silence is deafening. And so how can you drive a business if people can't talk about what's really on their mind? And so we decided in 2.5 weeks, we were gonna shut the firm down for a day to have a discussion about race. By the way, for an organization with 50,000+ people at the time, like 2.5 weeks shutting it down, I think that's very quick and very fast. And as you can imagine, around the table, there's every group. There's a business leaders, there's human capital, our diversity of our risk folks. There was not full agreement that this was the right thing to do, but ultimately you need to be willing to do it. I was meeting with the CEO in my normal course of business in those intervening 2 weeks, and he said to me that we were talking about this topic, and he pointed at me, he said, this is gonna blow up in your effing face. Like, I wouldn't do that. And it didn't blow up in our face. It could have gone wrong, like anything, but it didn't go wrong. And I spent the morning in Atlanta and the afternoon in New York. The stories that we learned, that you think you're doing the best you can. You think you do everything you can to get educated. You read, you listen, you study, you look at research. But to hear people like a Black professional in Atlanta pull out his business card and say, I carry this because I teach my son, or if I get pulled over, I can show them that I could afford the car because I had a job at PwC. We learned from a Black professional in New York that he feels safe in our office, but when he's going to Central Park to play softball and he's got his tank top and his tattoos are showing and he's got his head on backwards, he doesn't feel safe walking out there that. And these are the very people, by the way, that I'm counting on to do great work on our clients. And if they're carrying that baggage, how can we ever do the best work we can for our clients if they have these things in their minds? So it's important to me both personally, but also selfishly. If I don't create an environment where people can really be free to express what's in their view, we'll never do great work for our clients. And it was eye-opening that day. One person said it to me best. On that day, July 21, 2016, we shed more tears than we had in our 150-year history all across the country, because we learned. And that was the beginning, like that. And now, whether you're in Boston, New York, or Austin, or anywhere else, but we're not perfect, to be clear, but we're comfortable talking about what's on our mind.
So I remember just following up on that particular interview, one of your managers came up to you and said, okay, what you going to do next?
Yeah. So that day ended, and you were kind of like breathe a sigh of relief, and like it didn't blow up. Like, you know, it was in Atlanta or New York. I was leaving the office at around 8 o'clock, and in our lobby, one of our professionals grabbed me, introduced himself. We talked about it, and he said that was really good. And I'm like, all right, that's good. And then he goes, but what's your role outside the firm? Like you're sitting on top of a brand like PwC, what's your role outside? And I will admit, first I was like, God, can I have a break? Like we just, I didn't say that to him, I thought that in my head. And, but that night I tossed and turned. Like I really tossed and turned, and he was right. Like in my case, our time in the role is finite. It's 1 or 2 4-year terms. And I began to think about what is my role other than driving revenue and all the things that you would expect a CEO to do. And I didn't know the answer, but I began talking to people, like people that I valued them and I knew they were open-minded. I talked to someone that John and I know, this guy Ron Parker, who at the time lived in ELC, talked to David Taylor at Procter & Gamble, and we brainstormed over months, not like one brainstorm, and ultimately landed on this idea, how do we help CEOs do better? And the whole idea was, when you think about it, we were going to ask CEOs, we went down a whole bunch of dead ends, like to be clear, like this was the idea we decided to go with. How do you get CEOs to lean in on a topic they know they're not where they need to be? It's a difficult conversation for them, and it's voluntary. Like just think about that. Like it's highest level. We're asking you to do something with us that we all know we're not where we need to be. You're uncomfortable talking about it, and it's voluntary. You don't have to do it. And we said, but like the whole idea was CEO action. And by the way, that branding was donated by this wonderful man named Mark Pritchard, who David Taylor, who at the time controlled the largest marketing budget in the world.
Awesome.
And the branding was amazing because it was CEO and action. And so we ended up asking people to lead from the front. And we didn't know how many we would get. And by the time we launched on June 12, 2017, we had 112. And today it's at 21.
That's fantastic.
But that was all because one young man felt comfortable coming up in the hallway at 8 o'clock at night saying, what's your role?
So there's so many thoughts going through my head. First of all, I didn't know that it was Mark Pritchard who, that was great.
Yes.
He is terrific. I mean,
Yep.
he ads that they have globally are just fantastic. So I guess my next question is going to be about the CEO action, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, your ability to listen and allow your worldview to get disrupted, because you could have, and you know, there are people who would say, well, yeah, that, you know, that happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen, you know. But I think you internalize that, right, which is a great role model for CEOs as well. You launch the CEO action, which is taking the work that you're doing beyond PwC to the broader ecosystem. What are you observing now, you know, in the signatories of the CEO action? What's the mood right now? I know you said they're walking this sort of fine tightrope, but what's the mood?
So great question. Just under 50%, so just under 50% of the 2,400 are active. Active, whether it be coming to seminars, participating in our mentoring, using our materials, engaging in our human capital leader group, our diversity group, our CEO group. So I'm proud like that at 50%, that's first of all 1,200 companies who are engaged, and it tells me they're still on their journey, they haven't given up. I think that number, I'd like to see it higher, but also 50%. What they're starving for is understanding best practices and learning. And what they're starving for is how do I handle something? And it ranges from how do I handle something that's in the news today, or that is an issue I'm dealing with today. And a great example would be, unfortunately, the issues in the Middle East. And so there's a lot of desire. How do I learn? What are you doing? Like, can we share? And that was the whole idea.
Right.
Like, equity and inclusion should not be a competitive issue.
Right.
We compete on a whole bunch of other things, but we shouldn't compete on equity and inclusion. We should rise in time for everybody. And so we're creating this ecosystem of sharing. So there's a lot of what I'll say, how are you handling whatever issue it is that leaders are dealing with, whether you're a CDO or CHRO or CEO. The second one is leveraging the tools. And lately we've been focusing on mentoring. Like even in your introduction, mentoring you do. What mentoring programs do we have? Coaching individuals, and there's a lot of interest in how do I scale mentoring.
So there's still a desire, clearly, to continue the focus but to also learn from each other in terms of navigating these troubles. But do you think that given these sort of really volatile times, do you think that the agenda that has been laid out is going to change in any way moving forward for the CEO?
I think we will see change. It's the pace of change, right? So it'd be easy to sit there and say, I love that, I feel confident about change, but all that is a direction. For me, the urgency, and I think for many of you, is the pace, right? And that's where I'd like to see a little bit more in terms of pace. At one hand, when I look at where the business world is from 8 years ago, are we better in my view? Yes. Have we arrived at where we need to get to? No. And so for me, it's about the pace of change going forward.
And to build on that, just to sort of, the pace of change, I think they're all concerned about the internal talent pool and ensuring that they have representation and the culture changes internally. What about the external landscape and sort of speaking out and speaking up? Is there sort of more of a desire to do that?
Well, actually, I would say to the contrary, right? Maybe when I talk to CEOs, I'll give you the real vulnerable conversation that I'm having with CEOs. Many of the vulnerable conversations are, Tim, I really care about this. It's really important to me. But I have investors, I have customers, I have a workforce that's divided, and the last thing I want to do is hurt those stakeholders. And if I speak out like many want me to, if I speak out, I actually could do more harm than good. And they're struggling with that at the end of the day. And I'm empathetic to that because, by the way, I'm proud to decide, at PwC, we've not done any layoffs since the latest downturn. Right. The amount of work it takes to do that is staggering. If there's so many levers you have to pull. The many of the CEOs that are worried about is they want to help, but they don't want to hurt. And so they're trying to figure out it's not a question of speak out or don't, it's how do I have the most impact? Is the most impact making a statement, or is the most impact working with policymakers behind the scenes? So, and to be clear, there's some, I love your bucketing, there's some that are just waiting to be clear, but when I look at these large brand-defining companies, don't confuse not speaking out with not caring. They're trying to navigate, if I speak out and say the wrong thing and my revenue drops 10%, there's people's jobs in line for that, right? Because I have investors. That's the real vulnerable conversation that I'm having with CEOs, which is how do I get it done? It's not whether it's important or unimportant.
So those conversations are being had and they're exchanging.
Yeah.
So to pivot a little bit to sort of the session that you sat in at the tail end, right? There was conversations with new majority leaders, and they talked about what they'd like to see happen in corporations. What would you like to, how do you think that there can be sort of this meaningful partnership to have an impact? What do you think that, how do you think that they can sort of have an impact?
When I look at how different groups that make up the new majority, they have massively impacted both me personally and our organization. By the way, when you impact the CEO personally, then he or she has the ability to impact their organizations, and whether it be John or Sid or the ELC or so many different groups, it's the education. It's frankly being in dialogues like it's understanding the issues. So most large organizations like PwC, you have tremendous internal resources, tremendous. But then having it corroborated or challenged by these amazing organizations that bring another perspective, that then allows us to have a different dialogue on the table. It might confirm we're on the right direction. It might say we've got to tweak this, or we need to make major changes. So the relationships that you're building and educating us is massively helpful. And I would say keep doing that. And by the way, judging by the number of people who join, I think that's happening. Don't stop that.
And continue to challenge.
Without a doubt. And point out our blind spots. And everybody's got them. And point them out and we can improve.
So the next question I'm going to ask with tremendous sort of sadness as well, because you're retiring after 35 years at PwC, and we have Jeff Gannett, also CEO of Macy's, who's retiring after 40 years, is it?
is 40.
Yeah,
Yes.
40 years. So huge loss because you've been really, you've stepped up as real champions and advocates and allies and put your money where your mouth is, because speak sometimes is easy, but to invest and to commit and to follow through with action is what makes a difference. So I guess the question for you is first, what with the sort of incoming new CEOs coming in, what are some of the things that you're seeing that they need to be aware of? What are some of the things that could impact their commitment to DEI? And then the follow-up to that is, what advice do you have for your successor who's coming in?
Yeah, they're probably similar. Like, I have this privilege of meeting with so many CEOs. What I'm seeing is there's a need to listen before action.
Mm-hmm.
There's a period of just listening, understanding what is really in the minds of your workforce, what is really on the minds of your customers, not just the ones that you know, but the broad group.
Mm-hmm.
There's a period where really understanding what's on people's minds is really important. And many CEOs have a really good practice of laying out all their stakeholders. And when I think about it, there's, as I mentioned, there's investors, there's your workforce, there's your customers, there's the communities that you do business in, there's the press, there's the education community, and a professional services firm. They're very important. Understand what's on the minds of all your stakeholders. It is incredibly important. That'll make you better. Like, you get the privilege when you're coming into a role of listening. Don't waste it. Like, don't waste it. It's okay. It's always okay not to know it all. It's particularly okay not to know it all at the beginning. And I think understanding what's on the minds of all your stakeholders. The second thing is understand what the opportunity is. If people focus so much on the risk, like, focus on the opportunity. If you truly have an organization where all views are valued and listened to, you're going to get better answers. In our case, for our clients, it could be innovation at a tech company, it could be a different experience in a retail company, but I passionately believe that. And we see that, and we know that. Studies have shown that, we've seen it qualitatively. So understand the opportunity. Like, don't be satisfied with where you are today. Understand what the upside is of a fully inclusive workforce. And then I think that will drive where you really want to go.
So do you share some of these learnings with Paul Griggs, right, who's coming in? Like, in terms of your own epiphanies, in terms of your own disruption of do you have those conversations with him?
Absolutely. I'm privileged. So my successor is a wonderful man named Paul Griggs, and he's been on my team for a number of years. So, by the way, it's like, I don't want to say he's seen me, he's seen us, right? Like us. And so it's deeply important to him, and we definitely talk about lessons learned, mistakes made. Of course there is, right?
So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to come to the audience to get your questions ready. And I guess, all too often in companies, you see that, it's a commitment of a senior leader or CEO, their personal passion, their conviction, along with systems and structures. But that really carries an organization forward. And then with the CEO transition, sometimes there's a dip in that commitment, and you have to almost start all over again. I think a lot of people here can relate to that. So I guess the question is, what sort of, just very quickly, some of the sort of systems and structures you've put in place to ensure that this commitment continues forward?
Yeah, so we a number of things. I mentioned our dashboards that we usually that's systematic right now. Our ERG groups, our 12 ERG groups are systematic right now. And so our dashboards and our ERG groups are they're embedded right now. So that, by institution does that. Our annual transparency. 8 years ago, none of the firms had transparency reports. Now we all have. And that's important. We have accountability and measures, and we work to that. Our programs, our different programs to different underrepresented groups, and our training and our mentoring, those are all institutionalized. But if I can, maybe just a quick story, just by coincidence yesterday, I have 15 mentees that I mentor, ranging from second year all the way to partners, and I've been mentoring for years. And generally I don't publicize that, by the way, because I don't want anybody to get out of sorts that I'm meeting with them. But one woman that I've been mentoring for about 7 years, she and I met yesterday, as we do every quarter or so. And she was like, what advice do you have for me, given the milestones that she's hit? And this would be some of the advice I would have for many of you. You don't need a program from the top. If it's tied to the firm's strategy, get 10 people together, get 5 people together. And so generative AI is a big focus for many organizations and big firms. So get a group together if you're passionate about that, if you're passionate about how that could affect diversity and biases. That's tied to the firm's strategy. You can get a group of people together and start a momentum inside the firm. Many organizations are entrepreneurial by nature, and we all have the opportunity to meet. And I told her, I said, as long as it's tied to the firm's strategy, if it's completely out in left field, then obviously that'll be a problem. But if it's tied to the firm's strategy of inclusiveness, generative AI in this case, don't be afraid to try a small experiments, because CEO action did come from the top. The best and the highest number of success items come up from within the middle of an organization, where people try something and then our job is to see it and scale it. And that was my advice I gave her. I think we all have that power with us. You don't need to be a CEO to do that.
Yeah, so it has to be top down, bottom up, middle out, and you need to see the organization with sort of champions and allies. I think that's the only way to get culture change. That's terrific. So the question I asked you before we came up here on the panel, what's next for you, Tim?
So the honest answer, I've been blessed 36 years at PwC, and I wouldn't change a minute for it. As I mentioned, we have term limits, so there's no drama. It's our governance. So I honestly don't know. I definitely won't retire. I'll do something corporate, maybe government, maybe corporate boards or something. But teaching, those are all things I'm exploring right now, and it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I'll continue to be a champion of just being in a different form.
Awesome. So we're going to make sure that we see your name linked with DEI regardless of what you do. That's terrific. So I'm going to go to the audience and ask you all for your questions. I know that the mics are up here. There's a question here.
Yeah, I think she's actually trying to get that place on. Hi, Tim. My name is Lisa Hoffman. You and I have actually emailed before when I used to work for my old boss, Kirsten Gillibrand, so thank you, and I want to talk to you about that afterwards. Anyways, so I'm now in the private sector, and one of the things that I think that really astounded me was that when you said you have about a little under 50% of those 2,400 CEOs that signed the pledge still practicing, right? What kind of conversations did you have with the other over 50% of CEOs who decided not to still institute the DEI protocols or the promises that they made in the pledge? And also, are there, what can we try to do in order to recruit more? That's the first part of my question. The second part of my question is, the Hill had a story just recently about how external forces are no longer pressuring organizations and companies to institute DEI. In fact, there are external forces pressuring them not to instill it. What type of external forces can we try to do in order to bring DEI back into the conversation again?
Yeah, great question. So when we started CEO Action, going all the way back 8 years ago, one of the things that and I mentioned we spent months and months going down a bunch of dead ends. One of the things that we decided we didn't want to do is we didn't want to shame CEOs. Honestly, we didn't view that as a sustainable strategy. What we wanted to do is inspire them to get in the boat. Having them in the boat was better than not having them in the boat. And if they were rowing at a different clip, we decided that was okay. The 50% who aren't engaging, what I meant, they're not active in the CEO Action by any of our programs over the last 12 months. Again, 50% are. What we're doing with those is we continue to invite them. We continue to welcome in, whether it be through our quarterly communications, whether it be through mine or my leaders when we're out meeting with these CEOs in the normal course of business. What could we do better? What tools would work for you? We're often because we also have direct access to the human resource leaders and the chief diversity office. So we're constantly asking, okay, why not? What could we be doing better in this trying to pull them along from that perspective? Let me hit the external forces one, and if you bear with me on this one, but we look at businesses. What's happening over the next 10 years for businesses is staggering. And at PwC, we call it business model reinvention. If you look at what's happening with deglobalization, if you look at what is happening with technology, if you look at what's happening with climate, almost every industry is going to be remade before our eyes. Almost every industry. Healthcare, we were talking earlier, remade before our eyes. Logistics will be remade before our eyes. Retail, banking, you go down the line, they'll be remade. Like healthcare will be done at home, it'll be data, it'll be self-service. Logistics will go from asset heavy to asset light, and platform business. Every business will be redone. Like there's no outrunning it because of where technology is going, what climate's doing. If you don't have your workforce fully engaged, and the bigger you are, the harder it is, around how do we transform and how do we do something different, then the companies won't make it. They'll end up getting split up, they'll end up getting sold, the CEO, they'll go through 2 or 3 CEOs, and the companies will whittle. That, to me, is why inclusion is so important. Because if your workforce isn't working together, you have no prayer. So to me, the external forces, it is the investor community. To me, the externals is those 3 big trends that I talked about, technology, climate, and deglobalization. Those external forces are loud and clear. I happen to believe the single biggest skill set that will be needed in the C-suite over the next 10 years is human capital related. I don't believe it's technology, I don't believe it's finance, I believe the biggest skill set, for the reasons that I mentioned, is human capital type skills who can have people move along. With 6 children, I've seen Finding Nemo like 1,000 times, but whoever can get the fish to swim in the same direction and tip over the net. And so that, to me, those forces, and I see companies doing an amazing job, and then I see others struggling. And so sometimes the forces, we might be looking for a force on a horse in a knight in shining armor, and they may be coming in a different way, but those forces are out there. It just might be in a different flavor that we're not expecting.
So it's not necessarily about speaking out and speaking up, as you said, but doing what's important to your organization in response to some of those external forces. So, great, thank you. There's a question here, and there's a question there. 2 questions.
Thanks, Tim. Really inspiring conversation. Really appreciate it. Wen Zhichen here. I'm from Morgan Stanley. I'm also the co-chair of our Wealth Management Investment Solution Council. So my question is that I feel like I don't know if the group feel the same thing, but there seems to be a trend where maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was not much of conversation, effort, resources on the D&I, but in the past, I would say 3, 4, 5 years, there's more and more we see growing, which is great. I think one of my questions is that how do you think this trend, how long it's going to take for this trend to go? Is it continue to go, to expand, to grow further? Or some of the other trends might go a little bit smaller or stacked? That's question number 1. Number 2 is that, as a leader of your team, we know that there's lots of work to be done for the D&I, and most of the people and the employees, D&I is one of their side gigs. They're voluntarily doing that, right? For folks like here, like helping all of the events here. And we know that, as a co-chair of our D&I committee, I know that it's a lot of work. How do you think that what's the strategy that keep them motivated, keep them, still keep that passion going on and commitment? There are some conversations on, okay, are they getting compensated in some ways, or tap on the shoulder, hey, you're doing a great job. What is the strategy that you see, or through the conversations with the CEOs, is the proper strategy to keep this passion and then support and going?
Yeah, 2 really good questions. The first one, I don't see the conversation going away, and part of it is in the book that you have, and the new majority, the concept of new majority. The reality is that the numbers don't lie. Like when you look at where the United States is going, you look at where global trade is going to be done, and you look at places like Southeast Asia and Asia in general, the reality is we're seeing a change, which will drive the conversation. So I do not see this withering. As a father of 6 children, I think this is going to be one of the wonderful things that they all deal with, and we all deal with, as we see more and more conversations. And again, the numbers will just drive that. I hope that's in a productive, constructive way, but I think the numbers will drive it, so I don't see it going away. On the second one, great point. I think what is absolutely really important is where someone is doing volunteering, and to be clear, I think there's a number of parts of it in any large organization where people volunteer. They might volunteer on recruiting, they might volunteer in the community, they might volunteer on technology strategies. So wherever you have people doing volunteer work, you've got to give the credit. If you're asking someone to give up 25% of their time to run an ERG group, you're asking someone to be a mentor, you've got to give credit for that, and that needs to be built into the evaluation cycle, which is something I see leading companies do. You can't just say, do it, but you still need to either produce your revenue or whatever. Like, there needs to be an element of that. It needs to be clear up front. Like, I will spend it. I think giving reward and recognition are incredibly important. The other thing you mentioned a couple of times, tone at the top. Like, periodically celebrate those people, just like you would any other group of volunteers. Like let people know it's important. Like, I'm grateful for my 12 ERG leaders, or in some cases co-leaders. Like, I'm great, and periodically we'll talk about that. Just like we'll talk about people who are doing all the mentoring on generative AI as part of their volunteer job. So I think that's incredibly important, and I see a lot of people doing that.
It's great. So treat it like any other business effort, and recognize, reward it like any other business effort. Great. So last question, just if you can keep it brief. I think someone had their hand up.
Hey Tim, my name is Rohini. I work for Meta as a product manager, and I've read a lot about you, so it's very nice to finally see you in person. First question is more around what is the future for the CEO action for diversity and inclusion? And second one is more around the fact that when you were a senior partner at PwC, so what was your business case for letting the board know that you'd be focusing X percentage of your time into an initiative like this, and how did you come to this?
Yeah, two really good questions. So I have a board of 18 partners, including 3 outsiders that I report to. So I'll answer the second question first. Because as you can imagine, 1 quarter into my tenure, this became a topic we were talking a lot about. First of all, I don't believe in dictatorial, so there was a lot of dialogue. It wasn't me going in there and saying, here's what we must do, right? There was a lot of dialogue, education, and awareness. But at the end of the day, what I tried to bring is the lens of our people, hear the voices that we're hearing. I try to tie it to our business strategy, which is if we want to differentiate, if we want to grow, and attract the right talent, and differentiate with our clients. I brought in voices of our clients. I brought in some of our clients that were saying we want a diverse team, and they were changing their contracting methods. I brought our clients who were changing their businesses, and so one of the just a quick funny story. One of the things I did when I was early in my tenure is I had the chance to meet a leader, and he said, "Let me tell you the biggest mistake that I made." And he said, "The biggest mistake is I often assumed everybody knew what I knew." And to be clear, I'll never be passed off as the smartest person in the world, but I get to meet a lot of people, right? And so what I needed to do is slow down and make sure they were seeing what I was seeing, not because of an intelligence or lack thereof, exposure. And so what I did with the board in those early days is made sure we were all seeing the same set. And this ties right back to the other outside groups helped me do that as well. I brought Ron Parker in to talk to my team. We had led at the time the largest bucket group in the country. So that's how I brought the board along, right? Which then all of a sudden it felt less risky. All of a sudden the money, which we fund 100%, seemed smaller than it did at the beginning. So I think stakeholder management and just understanding that we all don't see the same thing. So how do you have a respectful conversation about what you see? The second one is the CEO action is not me. It is the group, wonderful group of the 2,400 CEOs, including the active ones and the people who have really helped drive it. And the same with CEO Action for Racial Equity. It's 100+ CEOs who are massively interested in public policy and a bigger voice in cities and states and the federal policy-making range. And we've deliberately not put PwC branding on that, so it continues well beyond any one person.
That's great. So in closing, what gives you hope, Tim?
What gives me hope is when I meet with Catherine yesterday. I meet with people one-on-one and I see their development. One of the things I've thought about is my retirement party, which I don't want one. I just want a cheeseburger and a fry with a couple of friends. but it'll be my mentees. And to see their growth, has been absolutely incredible. And sometimes it's hard to when you plant a tree to see it, but then you go back 3 years, 4 years, it's growing. To see people really realizing their full potential really gives me a lot of hope.
That's awesome. The next generation of leaders. Great. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic.